Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's North Carolina Botanical Garden virtual lunchbox talk. I'm Joanna Massey-Lalikas, the Director of Education here at the North Carolina Botanical Garden, and we're so glad to have you joining us virtually today. We're bringing you today Lauren Pharr, who will be talking about her research focused on urban noise and light pollution effects on bird communities. We do hope if you live in the area, you'll come to visit our gardens. We are open for visitation to the public on Tuesdays through Sundays. Because of the size of this audience and using Zoom webinar, your audio and video are automatically muted. And we are recording the program. Lauren Pharr has given us the okay to share this with you all after the program. It'll come out to you after about a week. So if you remain in the webinar, we take that as your consent for being recorded. We do hope you'll join us for future lunchbox talks. We have a number of them coming up this spring season, and check out the link in the chat for registration for those. And we are always open to feedback at the end of the webinar. If you're on a computer, when you close the webinar, it will open up a survey for you, and we'll also send the survey out following the webinar. So please provide your feedback to us on the virtual lunchbox talk programs. So we would like to thank today our spring 2021 lunchbox talk event hosts, Sims Preston and Olympia Stone, for supporting our lunchbox talk series this spring at the dogwood level. Lunchbox Talk event hosts provide funds that support our program planning for diverse audiences, including captioning talks that are recorded and made available to the public. So Lauren Green today is my partner in moderation. She'll also be assisting our speaker today with Q&A. And we're really excited to partner with New Hope Audubon Society today. Barbara Driscoll is the president of the New Hope Audubon Society, and she is here with us today to introduce our guest speaker. Barbara, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thank you, Joanna. New Hope Audubon is always pleased to partner with the North Carolina Botanical Garden. They've been great partners with us through the years. In case you are in our area, New Hope Audubon is the local Audubon chapter for Durham, Orange, and Chatham counties. I'm very pleased to be able to introduce to you today Lauren Pharr. She's an ornithologist and current master's student at NC State in Raleigh, pursuing her degree in Fisheries, Wildlife, and Conservation Biology. Her research focuses on studying and analyzing urbanization effects, specifically urban noise and light pollution on avian species. She's also an engaged science communicator. Lauren has given talks to multiple groups, including Georgia Audubon and Hog Island Audubon in Maine, and has written and contributed pieces to a variety of outlets, including the Cincinnati Zoo, National Geographic, BBC Wildlife, and eBird. Lauren has received many awards, including funding from both the Alongside Wildlife Foundation and the North Carolina Wildlife Federation. And now I would love to hear Lauren. Thank you so much for agreeing to talk with us.
Of course. Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. So thank you to Barbara, Joanna, and Lauren for everything. Thank you to the Botanical Gardens and New Hope Audubon for hosting me. It's great to be here. Although, unfortunately, it would be better for us all to be in person, but hopefully that will come back sometime soon. But I do like the fact that, all these presentations and talks are very, accessible to a ton of people from all over the world, which I saw from the poll that you guys are from everywhere. So that's amazing to me. And I'm really glad that you all came out this afternoon and decided to spend your time with us. So again, my name is Lauren Pharr. I am a current master's student at North Carolina State University. And today I'm going to be talking about the effects of urban noise and light pollution on avian communities. As a master's student here at NC State, my research is more on the lines of urban ecology because, as you probably know, for those who live in the Triangle area, Raleigh is a huge urban area. So what better thing to study than urbanization effects? So if you have been fortunate enough to come to meetings for Georgia Audubon and Onondaga Audubon, and even if you attended the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences here in Raleigh, if you attended that as well, this presentation will look somewhat familiar to you. It's one of my presentations that I get requested for most often. Everyone says that they love it. So hopefully, you know, I hope you love it as well. And as always, again, keep your questions towards the end and we'll do a Q&A and I'll try to answer them to the best of my ability. So without further ado, I will get right into the presentation here. There we go. So first I wanted to start off with this little scenario, which I think it sets the scene very well. So to the depiction to the left, we have a witch here who is talking to her neighbor, and she tells her neighbor, "I remember when this was all forest." So as we could infer, the witch is, you know, has just moved from a highly forested area to a now more urban area. We see a whole bunch of houses. We see a guy down at the bottom left mowing his lawn, and we see birds in the sky there at the very, very top. So I pulled this from a study, which as a graduate student, you do a ton of reading for your research, but I pulled this from a study because I think it kind of, again, sets the scene really well and kind of puts this all into perspective. So urbanization, defined as the population shift from rural to urban areas, is projected to increase by more than 3 billion people between the years of 2010 and 2050. Now, if we step back and think about that, that's a lot of people. And although that seems like a lot of time, that's a lot of time. That's a lot of people for that amount of time. So I always tell people who, you know, don't really think about urbanization that much and urban effects. I always, you know, which is again why I love to give this talk, it sort of lets people take a step back and sort of allows them to realize what impacts we're bringing in onto wildlife, because we essentially moved into wildlife's homes, wildlife's habitats. So they, because of that, they have to adapt to our effects, which again is what all falls under urbanization. Now, before I get into those effects here, I do want to talk about some definitions. So I'm going to give you two definitions here, and I'll just probably stick to the simpler terms because these are kind of lengthy and mouthy and they're just tongue twisters, but I do want to expose you to these two words because they are mostly used in the urban ecology realm when we're talking about urbanization. So first we have anthropogenic, which is chiefly of environmental pollution or pollutants. So talking about environmental pollution originating in human activity. So this could be anthropogenic noise, which can come from things like cars, busy streets, construction sounds, anything like that is what we refer to as anthropogenic noise. And then artificial light at night, or ALAN. This is very commonly used when we talk about urbanization. And it's exactly how it sounds, a light source that is not naturally occurring. So for this, we can think about in urban areas, there's a ton of, you know, lampposts and lights. This can be, you know, this could refer to illuminated buildings per se, and illuminated billboards. So again, buildings that stay on all night is one example, and then illuminated billboards is another example of what we call artificial light at night. And all of this can contribute to a thing that we call sky glow. So sky glow is, again, just like it sounds, a unnatural glow in the sky, which we'll get to further on in the presentation of how that can impact avian communities. But essentially, due to the fact of all of this artificial light at night and all these different sources, this contributes to sky glow, which can therefore contribute to negative effects on animals who might use the sky and the stars to orient themselves at night, such as birds. But again, we'll get more into that further on in the presentation, but I did want to introduce you to these terms, but for the sake of tongue twisters and everything like that, we'll just stick to urban noise and urban light pollution. So before we get into birds specifically, I do want to talk about some common species that you might find in urban areas, because one thing about science is that although you might focus on a certain topic, you kind of have to understand the whole realm of it, and then you can sort of, dive down and get more specific. So I pulled 4 specific animals here, and basically just want to go through how you would think urbanization might impact these particular species or their populations. So first we have deer, and we could imagine that deer might suffer from lack of forest habitat. So when we're building, our schools, our roads, our housing developments, everything like that, we have to clear cut forests. And when we do this, deer love mature forests. They bed in mature forests, they live in mature forests. Forest is their home. And so when we're coming in and we're, clear cutting all these forests and everything, you could imagine that their habitat, slowly decreases. And because they like mature forests that, aren't that old yet, they don't get a chance to mature if we're continuing to cut them down. So again, this could have an impact on deer, but keep in mind too that deer populations, they're huge. Like they're in no way, a threat. Their populations are in no way a threat. But again, lack of forest habitat just is a way that, their populations could suffer from urbanization effects. So the next animal we have here are turtles. So when we think about turtles, we think of the turtle crossing the street. And so which brings up the point that, if you ever see a turtle and you're in an area, a space where you can help it cross the street, please do. And always help it cross, in the direction that it was going, not where it was coming from. But anyway, so we can imagine that, with turtles, there's a ton of vehicle fatalities because roads basically cause habitat fragmentation. They cut right in the middle of, a habitat or right in the middle of land where turtles and other animals might be trying to cross the roads. So what people have done in this sense is that in some cities, but not all cities, they have created, wildlife overpasses and underpasses. And it was pretty cool because in my class today, which I didn't really think about, you would probably see more wildlife underpasses than overpasses, because overpasses, which go like over the road essentially, they cost a ton of money. So, and I didn't really think about that, but so if you are in an area where you might see an underpass or an overpass, this would be what this is specifically used for, to help wildlife cross areas of busy roads or highways safely. So the next animal we have here is a raccoon, and I put supplemental feeding as something that you might think about when we think of raccoons. Now, I don't mean this to say that we are intentionally feeding the raccoons. At least I hope we're not feeding the raccoons, but you can imagine that in urban areas, there are, tons of, garbage. There's there's more garbage, in urban areas, a ton of garbage in urban areas. And so we could imagine that animals like raccoons, who like to forage on our garbage and everything like that, love to get into our trash cans, etc. So when we do this, we talk about supplemental feeding. And what that essentially means is that these animals are depending on us essentially, instead of learning how to forage and find food in the wild for themselves. So in this case, I just tell people, just make sure your trash is secure, make sure, things like, people sometimes will like leave their dog food out and everything like that. And raccoons love dog food. So I just ask people, to just basically, always have your trash in a safe location and always away from, where wild animals can get it, because essentially we want animals to be able to fend and forage for themselves instead of relying on us, so to speak, and relying on our waste to get by, because this, makes it hard for animals if they don't know how to forage themselves, because they're relying on other sources instead of learning how to survive, basically. And then last but not least, this one is my favorite because not a lot of people think about this. So I have an ant here that's representing pesticides. So in urban areas, pesticide use is, it's really high, it's abundant. So you could imagine that with this, insect populations are decreasing like significantly. And then in turn, when insect populations are decreasing, we have to sort of think about how that's affecting other wildlife who depend on insects. So birds here are a great example because with birds, nestlings really depend on a high insect diet. So you can imagine that with pesticides, if insect populations are decreasing, nestlings may not be getting the right nutritional values and everything that they need in order to develop. So pesticides, again, are one that I get all the time that people are like, oh my gosh, I never thought about that. Well, it's one that I like to explain really, really well. So, but in turn, in summary, this is just some ways that, some species in urban areas can be impacted by different urbanization factors. But keep in mind that there are plenty more species in urban areas, and there are plenty more urbanization factors, but I just wanted to sort of point out these specific 4 and these specific urbanization factors just to kind of give you an idea and to get your brain thinking. But before we get into birds, again, but I know this is why you're here, but before we get into birds, I do want to sort of go over the potential effects of anthropogenic noise and artificial light at night. So urban noise and urban light pollution. So first to the left, we have anthropogenic noise. So some things that anthropogenic noise can cause on wildlife in general, it can cause chronic stress. So just like, if you're around something that's really loud or, loud noises, anything like that, that's causing you stress, it can cause wildlife stress. There has been many studies, particularly, in like marine mammals and things like that, which is why I love this depiction because it just depicts it really well. But marine mammals, I mean, that can go all the way out to the sea. Urban noise can, travel all the way out to the sea and impact species who are, in the sea, which is, not cool for them, but it's pretty cool for scientists to study. And anthropogenic noise can also impact communication. So species, wildlife who rely heavily on communication, like behavioral patterns for, reproductive patterns, anything like that, where they're trying to communicate with one another or their significant other, or even their young. Anthropogenic noise has a potential effect on communication. And then to the right, we have artificial light at night, or ALAN, which is the acronym. We have 2 things here. So we have migration. It can affect migration. So going back to the sky glow. So I use birds as an example because birds are a wonderful, if you couldn't already tell, birds are a wonderful species to study these effects on. But again, wanting to put it in a whole wildlife perspective before we dive more specifically into birds. But birds just happen to be a common example used here. So artificial light at night can impact bird migration. So birds use the stars in the sky and things like that to orient themselves at night in order to travel, nocturnal migrating birds. And so when we have things like sky glow, that can impact the stars in the sky and other landmarks that they may use at night, which in turn impacts their migration, in which I actually have a study in further slides that kind of show this, that we'll dive more deeper into. But so artificial light at night, that's one way it can impact migration, and it can also impact growth and development. There have been studies which suggest, which again, birds are a great example for this. There have been studies which, suggest that artificial light at night can impact nestling success. It can impact which in turn impacts their growth and development. One of my colleagues actually here at NC State, she's also in my lab, and she's also an ornithologist. She's actually studying the effects of light at night on barn swallow chicks. And so her findings will in turn, contribute to this overall theory of light at night affecting growth and development in avian species. And then last but not least, I have foraging here. I actually made a change to this. at the last minute during one of my other talks. But foraging can actually go hand in hand with both anthropogenic noise and artificial light at night. So we can imagine that with anthropogenic noise, which is another example way down the road that I have in here, but again, I'm going to use birds because why not? Birds that rely, on their hearing, so owls, for example, and other common passerine species, they use their hearing to forage. So you can imagine that with anthropogenic noise in urban areas, if it's very high, it can impact their foraging behaviors. Artificial light at night. So there are some species, again, I use species who hunt at night. So nighthawks, your raptors who may hunt at night, etc. Artificial light at night can impact, their foraging patterns, their foraging behaviors. So all of this to say, again, just some different ways that urbanization, specifically anthropogenic noise and artificial light at night, can impact wildlife. But you guys are here for the birds, right? So I hope you enjoyed that little brief interview. But with everything that I talked about, although I use some birds as examples, because why not? Birds experience all of these things too. So now I'll sort of dive deep. I've pulled at least 2 studies, I think, for each, or at least one, of some examples when talking about artificial light at night and anthropogenic noise. So first we'll talk about anthropogenic noise. So different ways that this can impact avian communities. So anthropogenic noise can impact circadian rhythms. It can cause a fight or flight response. It can impact reproduction, and it can also impact communication. But the one with the asterisk, circadian rhythms and communication, are the 2 that I will dive deeper into. So for circadian rhythms, it's just like we have a circadian rhythm. So circadian rhythms are a natural internal process that regulates our sleep-wake cycle. So our circadian rhythm is everything to us. And just as, like with us, if our circadian rhythm gets interrupted, we might, become cranky. I mean, it can cause us stress, everything, because our circadian rhythm is everything. For animals and many organisms, it serves as an environmental cue. So circadian rhythms can, they can sort of regulate behavioral patterns such as like reproduction, migration, etc. Everything like that, that it can regulate, anything like that when it comes to birds. So circadian rhythms, like ours, if it gets interrupted in birds, it can cause a whole bunch of stress, which is bad for the birds. But again, it's pretty cool for scientists to study and figure out. So this is one study, one of my absolute favorites, discussing birdsong and anthropogenic noise and measuring, looking at vocal constraints between birds in forested areas and city areas. So as we look at our graph here on the left, just to keep it simple, we have 2 lines. So we have a green line, which is representing our forested areas, and we have a blue line, which is representing our city areas. So as you can see, I want you to pay attention closely to the blue line. In the city, we see that birds are really singing high. As we get to a higher frequency, we see that birds are really increasing their vocalizations. So scientists discovered that this study was done with common blackbirds. They discovered that blackbirds in cities were able to basically mask this anthropogenic noise, and they were able to change their frequency and amplitude, etc. They were able to change different characteristics within their song in order to basically sing over all this noise pollution, which we call behavioral plasticity. It can occur in some species, but not all species. But for species to have the ability to do this, it's some pretty cool stuff, which is sort of leads into the, factor of species being able to survive in urban areas, because a lot of people want to say, well, if urban areas are so bad, why do I see a lot of birds? Well, there's a ton of birds and ton of bird species who are readily adapted to urban areas. They can, overcome a bunch of things. But again, it's still interesting to study, at different rates and everything like that, what species can and can't do certain things, etc. So in this study, they found that common blackbirds were able to mask out anthropogenic noise compared to blackbirds in forested areas, they saw that the blackbirds in the city areas were singing higher. So again, just a cool way of how birds can adapt to urbanization. This really isn't I guess a terrible thing. I think it's actually a good thing that birds can do this. It's, terrible that noise pollution is contributing to it, but at the same time, it's pretty cool and pretty awesome that birds can adapt to this changing environment that we're so throwing upon them, if you will, as humans. So next we'll do urban light pollution. So ways that light pollution can affect avian communities. Again, it can affect their circadian rhythms with stress and everything like that. It can affect reproduction. It can affect migration, foraging. Oh, excuse me. Sorry, let me go back. I'm sorry, y'all. Okay, foraging, chronic stress, and growth and development. But for the sake of it, I will just be discussing foraging and migration. So this one goes back to the light pollution that I was talking about before with the sky glow, which I probably hinted on a few times now, but again, this is one of my favorite studies as well. So this was looking at basically how light at the National September 11th Memorial, at the museum's Tribute to Light at Night, or Tribute in Light in New York, was basically looking at how these birds oriented themselves and responded to these bright lights. So researchers found that when these lights were illuminated, birds were very stressed. They aggregated, they decreased their flight speed, they circled, and they increased their vocalizations. Because if you can imagine, this bright light is, shining, and they're just so disoriented. They're trying to call out to each other, trying to, figure out what's going on. So in order to combat that, when the scientists, turned off the lights, they saw that these behaviors decreased and the birds were fine. So just, another study which shows the impact that urban light pollution has, particularly artificial light at night has. Because again, going back to what I said earlier, birds use the stars and anything else in the sky to orient themselves and migrate. So with our urban light pollution, that is contributing to sky glow, which is therefore impacting avian species who are trying to migrate at night. But I think one thing to note, especially in science, because in science, I think us as scientists, we sort of want to figure out, how things are like impacting species or impacting things in a bad way. And we don't really look at the good, because in order to look at the bad, you got to look at the good as well. So light pollution specifically can actually be beneficial to some species. So species like, owls and nighthawks, etc., who may hunt at night, light pollution can be used actually to their advantage in order to forage and find their prey. Some passerine species have been found in a recent 2020 study, I believe, have been found to benefit actually from light pollution. So these scientists basically found that birds with better visions did well with light pollution, which increased hatching success and raising chicks, because these parents were able to forage later at night, and therefore, they had happy chicks because they were able to forage. The light was helping them forage, and they were able to, bring that stuff back to their chicks. But then you have to look at it too, on the flip side, light pollution can be, again, when I talked about pesticides, this is just another way for insects too. Light pollution can sometimes be detrimental to insects. So you kind of have to put that factor in there with it as well. But again, just some different ways that light pollution can be beneficial to some species. And then some other results of urbanization. So I just wanted to touch on a few here. So some other results of urbanization are predation. And I will say, do not get an urban ecologist started with outdoor cats. We will go off on a tangent when talking about outdoor cats. Outdoor cats are probably, they contribute a lot to avian survival and avian, studies of avian survival, which have found that, outdoor cats are really responsible for a ton of avian deaths, so to speak. So if you have an outdoor cat, or if you have a neighbor who has an outdoor cat, I urge you to, try to educate them about outdoor cats because they're doing some real damage to bird populations when we're talking about that in urban areas. And then other birds like raptors and things like that, there's things such as like Cooper's hawks, I believe, and everything like that. They have actually been found to be able to adapt to urban areas as well. And these guys like to prey on small passerine birds as well. So again, just two different kinds of species here that we're discussing when we're talking about predation. Food supply, so this is again going back to things like pesticides and then touching on what I said about light pollution and insect populations. So you kind of have to think again about just how pesticides and light pollution in this sense is affecting food supply, because birds, especially nestlings, rely on a high insect diet. So again, just something to think about there when it comes to urbanization. And then last but not least, species richness. So basically just what kind of species we find in urban environments, just due to the resources that are available in urban environments. So sometimes you may not find a lot of, native plants, native things like that maybe, birds like thrive on in urban environments, and therefore that particular species of bird may be lacking. So, but this isn't to say that, bird populations are low in urban environments again, because if you're in an urban environment, there's tons of birds. There's tons of birds. It just, you have to kind of look at the species of bird that you see and then just kind of think about, oh, well, why isn't this particular species, in an urban environment? Like, can they not survive, or what's going on? So that's what we mean when we refer to species richness. So this all takes me to kind of what I do as a ornithology student here at NC State and an urban ecologist. So what I have done here is actually I've done two specific projects. So my first project was called Cardinal Capture, and the lab that I'm in, so my advisor, she is a highly well-known citizen scientist, Dr. Karen Cooper. So we were trying to think of a way to involve and put citizen science into my project, discussing the effects of urban noise and light pollution, trying to analyze urban noise and light pollution. So what we did was we made up this project, Cardinal Capture, which was a citizen science project created to determine the influence of urban noise and light pollution on avian physiology. So if you're a birder, specifically if you're a bird bander, you're probably thinking, why did we choose the northern cardinal? Because northern cardinals, bird banders will know, northern cardinals, they're really bitey, and their bite hurts. It hurts really bad, but they're beautiful birds nonetheless. But we decided to choose cardinals because they're very abundant in urban areas. They're very abundant everywhere. They're just a really great bird species whose populations are doing really, really well. So what we decided to do was we decided to recruit some volunteers, some homeowners, if you will, around the Raleigh, Durham, and Chapel Hill area. And so how we did that was we created Cardinal Capture and we put it on a website called SciStarter, which if you haven't checked that out, I highly suggest you check that out, because it is a platform that, has a whole bunch of citizen science projects on it that you can be involved in and you can contribute to science. So it's really cool nonetheless. But so we did that. We put this on our website. And we started to recruit volunteers. We probably recruited around 54 volunteers, which, I mean, it may not sound a lot, but it was pretty good to us. We were stoked about that. So then the next thing was, how would we differ, different urban noise and light pollution levels, if you will. So we had some collaborators in the Parks and Rec Service, and they basically took our map of Wake County and they were able to extract our noise and light levels of Wake County. So we took this, and this is how we sort of recruited different volunteers. We wanted to get volunteers all around Wake County who were in different areas of noise and light. And so what we would essentially do with that was we would go out and we would mist net. So this is a technique in order to capture songbirds, and we would mist net, and we would take all these measurements of these northern cardinals, morphological measurements, so like wing, tarsus, everything like that, and physiological measurements, so like blood samples, because in urban areas there have been studies which have found blood parasites. I know that sounds gross, but blood parasites in avian species, which basically tells you that, it's a sign of stress. So another way that urban areas can impact avian communities, a sign of stress would be blood parasites found in their blood system. So we're gonna do this. It was all set up. We were super excited. I had about 4 undergrad helpers that were gonna assist me, technicians, if you will, and they were gonna assist me, and I had all my volunteers, but then COVID hit. And COVID essentially sort of kind of ruined everything. So a lot of our projects here at NC State were kind of either paused or sort of shut down. And so with this project, since it was going to be, around people, and I was going to have people, interacting with us, and it was going to be in urban areas, et cetera. And just due to county mandates, we decided to put this project on hold, if you will. So the thing about a master's is that you only have 2 years to complete it. So by the time COVID hit and everything, I was about to be in my 2nd year. So we decided to sit down, and we were kind of like, okay, what can we do, essentially, as a next step? So what we decided to do then was our second project. So this project is Neighborhood Nest Watch. You may have heard of it, but it is a project that is out of the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. And basically, it's another citizen science project who uses the same techniques that we were going to use for cardinal capture. But instead, they use their data to determine the influence of human-built environments on bird populations. So specifically, their data collected helps them answer questions from avian health all the way to reproductive success. So what Neighborhood Nest Watch does is that they measure avian success and reproduction along a rural to urban gradient. So essentially what this is that, areas with low infrastructure, buildings, and human population would be your rural, and then the opposite, areas with high infrastructure, high human population would be your urban, so your rural to urban gradient. And so what they basically do is they encompass this. They went, in a specifically 100 kilometer spatial extent, if you will. That was in order to help them measure out different, areas within Washington, D.C. in order to specifically look at different avian species and how they were doing in these urban populations, which I'll get to the specific species in a second. But anyways, but this was what Neighborhood Nest Watch was. So we'll get into that actually in a minute, so I won't explain that just yet. But this paper right here, Characterizing Avian Survival Along a Rural to Urban Land Use Gradient, is sort of what my next project that I'm doing now and about to finish up is based on. So basically, Neighborhood Nest Watch took their 7 different focal species and basically wanted to see how their survival was doing along a rural to urban gradient. And they actually just, to put it in simple terms, found out that reproductive success and survival was species specific. So certain species did well while other species didn't. So for example, species like cardinals and American robins seem to benefit from urban environments. So if we look at these graphs here, these regressions, we see that for the most part, their survival, kind of was stable, or they kind of did well in urban environments. But if we look at the 2 wrens, so Carolina wren and house wren, we see that their survival is really decreased. Their survival is very low. So essentially this study basically gave us, the hint to be like, okay, more work needs to be done in this area, and more work needs to be done in any area. But for the most part, with this, more work needed to be done to maybe determine why certain species was, or why these two species in specific were responding the way that they were in different, urban areas. So this is where my work comes in, which is my current project. So my current project is analyzing the effects of urban noise and light pollution on adult avian survivorship. So these are the 7 focal species here that Neighborhood Nest Watch focuses on. These 7 species are highly found in the DC area, so that's why they chose them, because they're abundant, their populations are great in the DC area, they're everywhere. So from left to right, we have the northern cardinal, the American robin, the gray catbird, the Carolina wren, house wren, song sparrow, and Carolina chickadee. So basically with my project, I was able to take Neighborhood Nest Watch data, which is a 20-year data set, and put it with my noise and light pollution, because remember earlier for cardinal capture, I had explained how, how Parks and Rec were able to extract different noise and light pollution levels. Well, they were able to do the same thing with Washington, DC. And so we took their 20-year data set and the data with the noise and light, and we basically put it together in order to look at these survival rates of these different species in order to see, how their survival was in DC compared to urban noise and light pollution. So we wanted to see whether urban noise and light pollution affected their survival, essentially. I am actually almost done with this project. I'll be done with it in probably like 2 weeks. I'm set to defend in like 2 weeks. So with that being said, I can't discuss, the results that we found because it's not final yet, and my publication isn't out on it yet. But I will say that, to put it in simple terms, the results were, again, species specific. So a lot of urbanization studies, you will find that a lot of results are species specific. Again, going back to some avian populations, some certain species can, really do well in urban areas, while others cannot. And it's up to, scientists and researchers to sort of determine why that is, which is always going to be an open-ended question. Yeah, so that's me. That's my research. I hope you enjoyed this presentation. I hope you got something out of it, even if you just leave with like one new thing that you learned today. I know I've done my job. So feel free to please follow me on social media. My social media handles are there at the bottom to the left. And then up there to the right, you have my name, my email, and my website if you want to visit, if you want to reach out, ask a question, anything like that, feel free to. So yeah, without further ado, that's my presentation. So I'm glad that you guys were able to attend. Thank you.
All right, we've got a couple questions for you, Lauren.
Sure.
The first one is, are there any lights that are better or have less effects for birds? My neighbors are very security conscious.
Yes, so that's a good question. So definitely any lights that are automatic. So we love automatic lights. So any lights that go on and off, floodlights, anything like that, that go on and off would be great. I actually got a question the last time I did this talk, talking about solar lights. So solar lights are fine as well, because they're like, they have small watts, like they won't be that detrimental to the environment as would like a lamppost or an illuminated building. So if you want to go for solar lights, that's fine too. But anything that, is automatic that cuts on and off when you're not using it would be your best bet.
All right, and we've got another
good question, by the way. Thank you for that.
It's a good question. Another one would be, how successful have cities been in reducing night lighting of buildings and non-game lights of stadiums?
Oh yes, that's another great question. So it depends on the city. For one, it really depends on the city, which again, it goes back to when I was discussing the wildlife passages. It's just all gonna take time. It's all gonna take that big push to be like, okay, we need to do something. But for the most part, I would say some cities, I can't think of one off the top of my head, but I just thought about one this morning. Now I've lost it. If I remember it, I'll come back to you. But some cities have taken the initiative to, cut off lights at night, especially on illuminated buildings, that, you know, if nobody's in them, why are they on kind of thing. You know, so there are sometimes agencies and things like that, when they're going to build like housing developments, there are some who will take into account and sort of do like an environmental assessment, you know, before they start building. So again, it just all depends on the cities, and it's very, very city specific. If I think of that city, because it was on the top of my head and now it's gone. If I think of it, I will let you know. But again, I would really highly suggest that you go to SciStarter and look at, there's projects like Globe at Night, and there's another light pollution project actually as well. And if you want to like contribute to science and anything like that, they're really great projects to look into. So I would highly suggest that.
Great. And kind of related to that question, did you look at the NestWatch data measuring the light pollution and noise pollution this year compared to previous years? So I'm guessing they're getting to the, has things changed with COVID? Is there differences in the data from that?
Right. That is a good question. No, I have not actually, but I think that would be really good to look at, to see how things change with the noise and light. That would actually be and actually my collaborator he brought up the same question, and he was saying that would be a good thing to look at, because scientists love to look at change. I mean, that's it right there. So no, I have not personally, but hopefully someone will in the future. My collaborator, actually, he probably has some plans for that. So it's a good question.
All right, that's all the questions we have so far. Does anybody else have any questions? We've got a few minutes left if anybody else has a question for Lauren. Yes. Oh, and just like that, we do. Why didn't you use the neighborhood NestWatch data from North Carolina?
Oh, yes, of course. So Neighborhood NestWatch is out of the Smithsonian. So they're in Washington, D.C. Their whole project is in Washington, D.C. So the data is from Washington, D.C. So that's why we used it from D.C. instead of North Carolina, because that's where Neighborhood NestWatch is. That's where the Smithsonian is. That's where their whole setup is, in like D.C. and Baltimore, Maryland. So that data automatically just came from D.C. It would be cool to look at North Carolina's though, it really would. But we just decided to use their data that they collected in DC and surrounding areas.
All right, any last questions? Give people a chance to finish typing if they're typing a question. We have one. Any difference with LED lights versus other types?
Ooh, that is a good question also. I would say, and I don't want to tell you wrong, but I would say for the most part, what I have seen, LED lights, they're okay. I think they're fine. But with, yeah, I would say they're fine. I'm gonna kid. I hate to tell you wrong. Like, I know that's a short answer, but but I would say for the most part, you're good with LED.
And a participant mentioned maybe checking out Lights Out Baltimore for more information about.
Yes, Baltimore. Whoever said that, thank you. That's what I was thinking about. Thank you. Lights Out Baltimore is it. Definitely check out Lights Out Baltimore. That's what I was thinking of earlier, and it just slipped off the top of my head. So definitely Lights Out Baltimore.
And she says, you're welcome.
For sure, for sure.
And somebody mentioned that they thought they were part of Neighborhood NestWatch in Chatham County. I know there is another NestWatch from Cornell.
Oh yes,
so
yes,
it could be.
There are different. Yes. So there are different ones.
Program.
There are different ones. Now that she says that, there are different ones. But again, we decided to use the DC's data because it was they had more of that data. It was like a 20-year data set, so they had it from a bunch of years. So it would have given us more data to work with to kind of come up with a conclusion. But Neighborhood Nest Watch is a wonderful program. I highly recommend anyone check it out. It's pretty amazing.
All right, and if we don't have any more questions, I'm going to hand it off to Joanna to wrap things up.
Lauren Pharr, thank you so much for joining us. We really enjoyed having you with us today, and I do hope that we can have you in person one day.
Of course, of course, of course. Thank you again. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it. Thank you for everyone who came out, and thank you for your wonderful questions.
Well, time to close out here. So thank you all for joining us. We hope you'll consider joining other Lunchbox talks in the future. And if you're not currently a member of our garden, we hope you'll consider joining. Thank you again for attending. We look forward to seeing you in another Lunchbox or at the garden in the future. Have a good afternoon. And thank you again to New Hope Audubon and Barbara for co-sponsoring this event. Have a great day.